Good afternoon, everyone. I'm indeed going to speak to you about, it's a bit loud, coping with peace-building complexity. And what I would like to talk to you about is humanizing the world in the post-conflict setting. A lot of our focus thus far has been on the humanitarian emergency period, if you like. And a lot of us has reflected on the problems, and especially related to issues in terms of local ownership and so on. And what I would like to talk about is really a big shift in our understanding of local ownership. Local ownership is generally widely accepted. It's part of our discourse, as Alia said, but it's very poorly implemented. It's very poorly accepted in our daily lives. So I want to talk about how can we really change the paradigm of understanding local ownership. So I'm going to talk about the need for a radical shift in the way we understand peace building and peacekeeping, away from what this picture symbolizes, is that peace building is something that we as the international community do to them, the local societies. I want to talk about a shift where we see peace building as essentially local. But first, I would like to tell you about how I became interested in this question. As Mandy mentioned, I served as a United Nations volunteer in Timor-Leste with the United Nations Transitional Administration in 1999, and then I went back later as a UN Political and Civil Affairs Officer in 2001. Although I was a UN volunteer for only 3 months, this was one of the most intensely stimulating periods of my life. And I would like to encourage all of you who are starting out in this field to consider UN volunteers as one way of entering your work in this field. I would like to share with you one of my experiences from this time in East Timor as a UN volunteer. It came in January 2000 when I was chairing a coordination meeting with local leaders. In Timor-Leste's conflict, about 75% of the infrastructure was destroyed. It was a terribly destructive conflict. Part of what was destroyed is people's ordinary livelihood. And one of the particular things that was the issue in this meeting was the agricultural base of the society. People's seeds were destroyed, the seeds that they used to plant future crops. And the local leaders were talking with us and explaining to us that now is a planting season. They need seeds to plant, and they don't want to stay dependent on the United Nations providing them with food aid. And can we help them with seeds? I was in the unfortunate position to have to explain to them that we don't have seeds in the pipeline. We only have food aid. They then came up with a very simple solution. They said, okay, can you give us money? We'll just go across the border to West Timor in Indonesia and buy seeds. And again, I was in an unfortunate position to say that we don't have any cash to give, one. And two, seeing that at that time it was really tense between Indonesia and East Timor, the UN couldn't be part of a campaign of sending people across the border to go and buy seeds. So you can see I spent quite a bit of my time explaining what we can't do as the international community. But what I feel I really learned out of these experiences is that there's a lot of wealth of knowledge in local societies about understanding their own situation and how to cope with it. And I felt that as the United Nations in general, with me particular as a UN volunteer at that point, I came to the situation thinking that we as the United Nations have obviously done this many times before in terms of peacekeeping operations, and obviously we know what is better in this situation. We know what is better for the local people in this situation. But slowly, this kind of experiences that I've shared with you started to erode my confidence in our ability to know what is better. And this led me to start questioning and thinking about this area. What I wanted to share with you is this experience and this sense that I've come to, where I've come to realize that we see local ownership in most contexts as the international community as people accepting what we would like to offer them. In other words, we see local ownership as something that we want them to do, but we would like them to do it voluntarily. And this is because we feel that, especially where we've arrived in the West, after many hundreds of years of state formation, and we've arrived at a system of multi-party democracy, rule of law, human rights, the free market system, that this is obviously the best system. And we don't want other people to suffer and have to go through that same period. So we want to offer that system to them on a platter, with good intention. But I think what we miss in this process is understanding that it is absolutely necessary for every society to get their own norms and institutions from their own processes. It has to be homegrown. A model of norms and institutions is not something that you can just adopt overnight. It has to come through years of experience, of adaptation and of evolution. And so this concept and understanding of how norms and institutions develop in a society is something that I think we really need to focus on and understand better. And this leads me to the point where I want to argue that we need to understand peace building as something that is essentially local. Peace building is not something that we as the international community can bring to societies. For peace to be self-sustainable, it has to come from the local people themselves. I wanted to understand and study this better and understand where this comes from. What is the underlying reasons why we are struggling to implement this understanding of local ownership? As I said before, we have a kind of a broad acceptance of local ownership in our communities, but we're not implementing it. And one of the things I heard said a lot, and also today several of the people have mentioned it, is that the problems we are dealing with is complex. We talk about complex emergencies, we talk about complex peace operations. So I was wondering, what exactly do we mean when we say something is complex? And I went deeper into studying this, and I discovered that there's actually something called the science of complexity, or complexity theory. And I was wondering, if our situations are complex, can we learn something from the study of complexity that can be relevant for us in terms of how we deal with complex systems? So, from that application of complexity to peace building, I would like to share some ideas for you, which I think can really help us to make this paradigm shift in understanding peace building as essentially local. I'm going to try to take about a minute or two and just explain to you the gist of complexity. And I'm going to do that by focusing on only one aspect of complexity, which is non-linearity. Essentially, when we say something is non-linear, we mean that you cannot, through a cause and effect process, predict or control a non-linear system. And one way of understanding the difference between linear and non-linear systems is by looking at systems that are complicated versus complex. Let me give you an example. The International Space Station is something that is very complicated. It has so many different parts and so many different technologies that no single person can grasp it all. You need hundreds of engineers and scientists and a truckload of manuals to understand how that operates. But the point is that it is theoretically possible to understand exactly how that operates. We built it. Humans built that and put it in space. So we can understand exactly, theoretically, how that system works. That is a complicated system because it is linear, it's rational, and through understanding how the cause and effect works, we are able to shoot a rocket in space and place the space station where we want it in space, and we can send the shuttle up and refurbish it, replace it, replenish the stocks time and time again. That is a complicated system. If there's a problem, you can identify it and solve it again and again. A complex system, on the other hand, is non-linear and highly dynamic. And that means that We cannot predict or control a complex system. What is the implication for us? Well, things like the brain, our language, ecosystems, and all social systems are complex. And it means that when we deal with, for instance, the transformation of a society from an emergency to sustainable peace, we have to recognize that this is a complex problem that needs to be dealt with in a completely different way than you would deal with a complicated problem. And yet, most of us in the peace building field still approach what we do as if it's an engineering problem. We think we can make an assessment, identify the problem, design a solution, implement a plan, and voila, we're going to have an end product, which is somehow going to meet what we set out to do in the beginning. This is what we need to understand, that is completely different in a complex problem. So next time, one of your colleagues in the hard sciences on the other side of the building tell you that what we are doing is not rocket science, you tell them that what we are doing is much more complex than rocket science. One of the ways to understand complexity and complex problems is also something that has become, let's say, perhaps better known than complexity in our field, is to talk about messy problems or wicked problems. And as you can see from the screen, basically what we know when we're dealing with a wicked problem is that it's not something that has one solution. There's not one definitive way of solving this problem. There are no right or wrong. There may be better or worse outcomes, but even that is a social judgment. Different communities, different cultures will judge that differently. So the essential implication of recognizing complexity and recognizing wicked problems, recognizing that what we are dealing with is wicked problems, is that we have to accept that there's no off-the-shelf solution. There's no one model that is universally applicable. And that means that we as the international community, we do not have a superior claim to having the answer to what is right or wrong in a given situation. Put differently, it means that the local communities, the local societies, who have to deal with the consequences of their situation, who have to deal with the consequences of a relapse into conflict, they are the ones with the only real agency to make decisions about their future. What does that say about the role of the international community? It means that when we go into situations like this, we have the role and the duty to assist societies. We can help them to build capacity. But what we can't do is to make decisions on behalf of those communities. So we need to get a much better understanding of what is appropriate and not appropriate in terms of how we are relating to local societies as the international community. I have a picture of Charles Taylor up here at the International Criminal Court, the president of a country, ex-president of a country, who is now being tried and sentenced. And I have him up here because the message is that although local societies have the agency to make decisions about their own future, they are, of course, part of the international community. And as the international community together, we have set parameters for what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of state behavior. So the choices of local communities are constrained by the parameters that we have agreed to together as the international community. But that does not mean that as an international community, we have the right to make decisions on behalf of local societies in terms of the detailed step-to-step decisions they want to take in a given situation. We've also been reminded not to romanticize the local. Local societies also represent inequalities that cause conflict and that drive conflict. Local societies also represent various abuses and practices which we as the international community and which parts of that society themselves reject. So My message is not that everything goes. My message is not that we leave local societies on their own and step away as the international community. But my message is that in the relationship between the local society and the international community, we need to get the balance right. It's not that we are in a relationship between the international community and the local community, but they do what we want. They take the model that we give them, and the only thing that's important is whether we can convince them to do it voluntarily. My message is that we as the international community, when we deal with local communities, have to understand that it is our role that is complementary. Their role is essential. Our role is complementary to their role. It is in fact our role as the international community which is negotiable. We have many instances in the world where societies have successfully built peace on their own without international intervention or without major international support. We have examples of South Africa, for instance, my country. We have examples in Somalia, for instance, Somaliland, Puntland, various other such cases where communities have more or less taken this process on their own. So what we do find very often is that whilst local ownership is necessary, it is not necessarily sufficient. And that is why the role of the international community can be very helpful in situations where the local community does not have all the capacity and all the resources necessary to overcome their problems. So to conclude, my message to you is that if we want to achieve self-sustainable peace, if that is our goal, then we need to understand that peace building is essentially local. Thank you.